BloodStream Journeys is produced by BloodStream Media and made possible exclusively by BioMarin. Hi there, this is Heather Robb, and thanks for tuning in to Journeys, a monthly podcast from BloodStream Media that typically features the stories of 3 individuals within the bleeding disorders community. Happy April. It's my birthday month, but don't worry about sending me a present or anything. I'm fine. And this month, we actually have something a little special to share, sort of different. A few years ago, BloodStream Media created a 3-part series called The Factor Revolution, about the treatment revolution over the last 60 years and the complicated but massively important role that factor played in that revolution. So on today's episode of Journeys, we are actually going to share the compelling second episode of The Factor Revolution and let you know that the entire 3-part series is being re-released this month as BloodStream mini episodes. So, if you like what you hear, give the whole series a listen. It was compiled from over 40 interviews conducted by us and our collaborators at the HIV Story Project. Also features excerpts from the film Bad Blood and from news articles and reports from over the last 60 years. Highly recommend. BloodStream Media is proud to present The Factor Revolution, the last 60 years in hemophilia treatment.
Clotting factor came along in the 70s, the miracle drug that allowed us freedom to go to school and have jobs and build our own families.
On Tuesdays and Fridays, we would go to the doctor and he'd get factor, and it made our life so wonderful. I mean, we just dealt with hemophilia. It wasn't an obstacle anymore.
What I think happened in the 80s was just a lot of disbelief at first.
We started hearing rumors about AIDS in the late 70s, early 80s.
I made a decision that I wasn't going to tell anybody I had hemophilia.
And today, with prophylaxis, these patients really they can live a normal life.
Vigilance really is one of the keys in that shared responsibility that we have as patients.
What I think happened in the 80s was just a lot of disbelief at first, that the gay community was an easier target of feeling like you guys donated tainted blood and we got it in our product and this is your fault.
The hemophilia community looked at it from the standpoint that if you were gay and you were having unprotected sex, that you knew the risk factors you were taking. That if you were an injection drug user, you chose which drugs to use and which needles to share. Yet we had an FDA-sanctioned product to use that was approved by our federal government. That those who knew and were in the know did not let us know what was going on. We didn't have that right to choose.
It was callous disregard. You can't get around that. That's what it was. It was trading lives for money.
And so you had kind of like this intermediate time where you had all these guys whose wives had passed away and they felt guilty. And there's still some of those guys around. And that was actually the kind of the surprise of the epidemic that I don't know if anybody talks about that anymore.
Just as factor was becoming ubiquitous with hemophilia treatment in the United States, one of the worst healthcare crises the United States has faced in modern times hit the blood supply.
Shortly after cryo became available, the pharmaceutical industry got involved.
This is Glenn Pierce.
It looked like this might be an opportunity to make a more convenient form of cryo. The pharmaceutical industry began pooling large amounts of plasma together and then running it through protein purification columns to make a more concentrated form of factor VIII and factor IX. The development of these lyophilized concentrates allowed people a freedom that they had never had before. It allowed one to travel, to carry the factor with us in our suitcases, and if a bleed developed, to be able to treat that bleed right away.
This is Dana Francis in an interview with the HIV Story Project. Dana is a social worker in San Francisco who lived through the contamination crisis.
I think that the hemophilia community felt so deeply indebted to the pharmaceutical industry early on because they'd come up with this miracle drug that was going to change their life, and it did change their life. It was not the cleanest product early on, but it was revolutionary in how hemophilia care was done.
This is Val Bias, current CEO of the National Hemophilia Foundation.
Clotting factor came along in the 70s as a fractionized version of pooled plasma, the miracle drug that allowed us freedom to go to school and have jobs and build our own families, turned out to be a false savior.
It was considered an acceptable risk by not only physicians, but by government and by the commercial companies.
One would think that the logical next question, given the fact that it was widely accepted that there was hepatitis in these products, if hepatitis was in there, what else was there?
Just as community members were learning they had been exposed to this new disease, hepatitis C, and were starting to understand the severity of the threat, a new unknown disease emerged. Rumors swirled.
We started hearing rumors about AIDS in the late 70s, early 80s.
This is community member Randy Curtis.
The hemophilia population heard that one or two of us had gotten AIDS as well. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that there may be a connection within the blood supply.
I remember reading with interest 3 papers that came out in the New England Journal about gay-related immunodeficiency disease. The first question I asked was, am I susceptible to this disease? And I used a lot of denial. Denial is a really important trait when you've got hemophilia, and it got me through my young life up to that point. I was about 23 years old. And so I thought, well, maybe this is affecting some people in the community, but certainly it's not going to affect me. AIDS was associated with IV drug abuse, with homosexuality. It was something that people were beginning to be shunned. And I made a decision that I wasn't going to tell anybody I had hemophilia.
This is a common theme in hearing people with hemophilia speak about the dawn of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. At first, you didn't want to believe it, even with a strong feeling or even a near certainty that you and your blood brothers and sisters were exposed to the disease.
There was huge stigma, fear, and even backlash in the general population. Almost immediately, as awareness of the disease spread, you were at the risk of losing your job, your friends, your ability to move comfortably and freely throughout society.
It had been kind of building, right? A couple guys died here, a couple guys died there. The MMWR came out. Dr. Ebbett came out from the CDC in Atlanta. He was the only guy on the planet that had any knowledge at all. And he would tell us, kind of report to us how many cases there had been and what was going on and how many guys had passed away. And he wasn't alarmist, but you could tell that there was something going on and we were getting infected.
As awareness of the disease started snowballing, the understanding of HIV/AIDS did not keep up. And this is typical in a pandemic, a global outbreak, when people learn that the disease is rapidly spreading and they simultaneously hear fractured information and scary rumors about its origin and its transmission. And you add to that, of course, no known cure and no cure on the horizon, you have essentially chaos.
There were nurses that I worked with who I respected who were afraid to take care of the guys with hemophilia who were coming in for orthopedic surgery. There was a lot of fear and there was a lot of confusion in the hospital setting. The infectious disease people at the hospital said, no, these people need to be in isolation. We don't know enough about HIV.
It's easy to discuss the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sweeping nationwide terms. But the human stories, the individual journeys, are where we start to understand how something like this could happen.
Through those stories, we start to see how little oversight and governmental control was exercised and how abandoned people were by the systems in society that are set up to protect us.
To be told that your son has a severe condition, that most are crippled by the time they're 12 and don't have a long lifespan. I felt like this was a miracle drug for us.
This is Jeannie White, mother of Ryan White. You heard her in the first episode, and you will hear a lot from her in this episode.
For 2 years, when he was 3 years old, on Tuesdays and Fridays, we would go to the doctor and he'd get factor. And it made our life so wonderful. I mean, we just dealt with hemophilia. It wasn't an obstacle anymore. In 1984, Ryan was very sick, very, very sick. He had to go to the doctor quite often, 4 or 5 times that year, because he had fevers and everything. And I got a message the 1st of December that said that Ryan had hepatitis. And I thought, well, that's why he's been so sick. But it was just a few days after that he got off the school bus and he come in the house and he said, Mom, you got to do something. He said, I can't even get off the school bus without being tired.
Shortly thereafter, after more testing, the correct diagnosis came back.
He was diagnosed with AIDS on December 17th. So it was the day after Christmas. I really wasn't planning on it, but I said, Ryan, you know you've been really sick. He said, yes. I said, they say you have AIDS. He said, am I going to die? I said, Ryan, we're all going to die someday. We just don't know when. He goes, let's pretend I don't have it. I said, Ryan, we can't do that because we have to take these precautions to keep you from getting sick. He said, I don't want everybody that enters this room or to see me, that sees me, to say, poor Ryan, he's dying. He said, I just want to go ahead and go on with my life, okay?
Here's Dana Kuhn again.
When the test came out for HIV, it was recommended to me that I get a test for HIV.
Dana had only received clotting factor once. He mentioned this in the first episode. He was playing basketball at a church fundraiser. He landed weird on his ankle and the pain and swelling was extreme, so he went to the hospital, which is not something he did a lot because he had mild hemophilia. And for the first time in his life, he received clotting factor. One time.
They said, well, you know, there's a possibility it was in the blood supply and in blood products back in '83. We don't think that you would have it. You only got factor once. And they took that test and it came back positive for HIV. The bottom dropped out of my life. I'm trying to figure out how to live with this, but also how to make sure that my wife is protected from this once they told me it was sexually transmitted.
Randy Curtis again.
My wife and I went in to get tested, and within a couple of days called us up and said, you've been using a lot of clotting factor all this time, so you both have HIV and you're walking time bombs, and it's only a matter of time until you're dead.
Needless to say, the panic around HIV/AIDS led to, in some cases, deeply unprofessional behavior and insensitivities.
And even when doctors felt like they had good advice or answers, there were times it couldn't help.
This is community member Carl Wexler, who is one of the founders of COT, the Committee of 10,000, and this is his interview with the HIV Story Project.
My earliest memory of HIV/AIDS was sitting in my hematologist office with my pregnant wife, and he was saying that there was something wrong with the blood supply, do not have children. I looked at my wife's pregnant belly and back at him and said, too late. It really threw us in a tailspin because we didn't understand it. There was very little information. We didn't know whether it was transmitted through saliva. We were very scared that my daughter would be infected.
I was 11, 12 years old when I found out I was HIV positive.
This is community member Bobby Wiseman, a board member at the Hemophilia Council of California, and someone who lived through and survived the HIV/AIDS outbreak and the contamination crisis.
I literally just shut down. It didn't make sense to me at the time. It finally made sense to me when I was 16, 17 years old and went in for a clinic visit. And the social worker at the time would start to get into a conversation. If you're going to have sex, you need to use a condom. And my first question was, well, why? It just didn't clue in. I'm like, you can pull out. And she was like, because you're HIV positive and you have AIDS. I just broke down in the session, and it was the longest day ever. All the walls just fell down.
By the mid-1980s, it was clear that HIV was hitting our community members from all walks of life, at all stages in life, all over the country, all at once.
Married, monogamous ministers, preteens just starting to grapple with sex and relationships for the first time, parents of young children like Jeannie White, who you've heard from previously, and Louise and Clifford Ray, who you will hear from now.
We have 4 children. We have 3 sons and a daughter. All 3 of our sons were born with hemophilia. When the boys were 6, 7, and 8, they were diagnosed with HIV due to the medication they take for their hemophilia. Our oldest son, Ricky, died when he was 15. My second son died when he was 22. And Randy is still alive and well. He's 36. And I don't know why. He was actually the first diagnosed. I don't know if it's because his immune system was better. I don't know if it was because he was younger and had received less medication. We really don't know.
Here's Dana Kuhn again.
My wife started to come down with various bronchial symptoms, bronchial infection symptoms, and also other symptoms. Before long, she was hospitalized, and when she was hospitalized, that's when they found out that she was HIV positive. If you do the math, 1983 to 1986, when I was tested and told that it was sexually transmitted, there's 3 years of exposure. So the odds were not in her favor. And so therefore she also, as I won the medical catastrophe lottery with hepatitis C and HIV in 83, she also ended up winning the medical catastrophe lottery. And when she went into the hospital 3 weeks later, we were standing by her graveside.
Even with some understanding of what was taking place in the community and internally with himself and his wife, Dana and his wife had 3 weeks to prepare, to say goodbye, to come to terms with what had happened.
And what had happened was, remember, one infusion, one time for a torn up ankle at a church basketball game. And 4 years after that one infusion, Dana is saying goodbye to the love of his life. Her time on earth, frankly, stolen from her.
I didn't have knowledge of what they had done to me.
We'll get to the they a little later. The they, the blame, is a complicated question and one community members and healthcare professionals and the pharmaceutical industry still wrestle with.
When HIV came along, it accelerated HCV disease. So if the immune system is wiped out by HIV, hepatitis C was able to run rampant. And what that resulted in is many of my friends dying not of HIV, but of HCV as a consequence of their HIV.
The escalation of diagnoses and deaths was not unique to the hemophilia community. HIV/AIDS spread rapidly, and there were no real treatments, and of course no cure, but the bleeding disorders community had an additional circumstance working against it.
Because HIV/AIDS eviscerates the immune system, the hepatitis that would otherwise be difficult but manageable became fatal. Throughout the early 1990s, we were losing on average 1 person with hemophilia every day.
Oh, guys were dying right and left. I mean, the community was fairly large at that point in time. We knew each other. We'd had these clinics together. We'd actually had a summer camp together. I think that last year I was a summer camp counselor. There were no more hemophiliacs in my cabin. I had kids with von Willebrand disease and kids with platelet aggregation disorders, but all the hemophiliacs were dead.
The final tally, nearly 90% of Americans with severe hemophilia in the 1980s became infected with HIV/AIDS. Nearly 90%.
Those who were diagnosed while they were alive often faced extraordinary alienation.
This is Mark Skinner, a member of MASAC, National Hemophilia Foundation's Medical and Scientific Advisory Council, and the former president of the World Federation of Hemophilia.
At the time, there was an expression, so it was sort of referred to as the 4-H Club. It was not a club that you really wanted to be a part of. HIV or AIDS was associated with people with hemophilia, heroin addicts or IV drug users, homosexuals, and and Haitian immigrants, so the 4 H's.
Carl Wexler again.
We didn't want friends or family or anybody to know, even though I have a sibling who is also HIV positive. We pretty much kept it from extended family. We kept it from my employers. We kept it from the people that we socialized with. We kept it from our church group, which we were very active in. So we went into more or less fear protection mode.
I seen it very early on how people treated Ryan. Like he's had to have done something bad or wrong or he wouldn't have got this disease. This is God's punishment on people who do bad things. And there's some funny things going on in that household. That's how he really got AIDS. And we can't let Ryan White in school or every gay person in the country is going to come to our town. And you saw the religious community especially not wanting to confront this disease. Even my own church, who I taught Sunday school for 10 years, 2 to 4-year-olds, and I'd been going there to this church my whole life. To see how the Christian community even reacted was just overwhelming to me. How when I thought my faith and my support team would always be my church, and to see that it was not there.
That experience was not unique to Jeannie and Ryan White. Churches that historically were not comfortable with homosexuality were not a sanctuary for people with HIV/AIDS, at least not at the outset. There was just too much unknown. This is Bobby Weissman again.
With the Black church, there was a lot of stigma that if you were gay, you're going to burn in hell and you're an abomination. So when HIV, AIDS, GRID came into the forefront, from a lot of pulpits, there was preached this message that if you are a person that's gay or have AIDS, that's your fault and you're going to die. So a lot of African-American families who were confronted with their child or their spouse having an AIDS diagnosis, there was no place to turn to. The church was not welcoming or understanding of what was going on. Yes, the church would say, with your bleeding disorder, we can help you, but with the complications of either hepatitis C or AIDS, there was no place to go.
Mark Skinner again.
So we were taught early on that we needed to be open about our hemophilia. But given the stigma surrounding HIV in the 1980s and the risk of discrimination, we really had to do a 180. We were told to be very private, to be confidential, to not talk about your health status or your HIV. We had seen the experiences of young men with hemophilia, Ryan White and Ricky Ray, the experience of being banned from school, of being burnt out of your home. And it was an enormous time of fear, anxiety, uncertainty. You're living with a disease that had a lot of stigma and a lot of associations, and it really caused our community to go underground or to go internal. We did come together as a community to push back, but the emotional challenge on the families and the individuals living with hemophilia and HIV was enormous.
Everybody thought they were doing the right thing, but we wouldn't come together. The hemophilia community, this was a disease that we were all sharing. We were fighting AIDS and hemophilia together, but it was separated. There was like a line drawn. Ryan got to where he looked so good, you wouldn't even tell he had AIDS. He kept calling me and about bugging to go to school, and he says, Mom, he said, call the school, see if I can go visit. They have pizza on Friday, and I really like the school's pizza. I called Mr. Colby, and Mr. Colby says, call me back after spring break. I called back after spring break. He said, Ryan can't even come to visit school. He said, have you talked to the local Board of Health? And I said, but the Board of Health? He said, yeah. He said, I think you better call them. There's people that's been wanting quarantine signs put on your door. He said, but you need to hear it from them. They're going to vote in July whether to allow Ryan in school for next year or not. He said, just be patient until July. July came, the end of July came, we get a call from CBS Morning News. It went over the wires that the school board voted on the 15th not to let Ryan in school for next year. So that's when it just broke loose.
Ryan would go on to fight the school board. He would gain national attention and become an icon of the fight for HIV/AIDS awareness and treatment and compassion toward those who had the disease.
His and Jeannie White's stories deserve their own 10-part podcast series. I would strongly encourage you to Google him and check out the links on Ryan and Jeannie in the show notes. Ricky Ray and his parents, Clifford and Louise, who you're also hearing from in this show, fought similar battles.
When we first found out that Randy was HIV positive, this was in the, late 80s, 86, 87, when not a lot was known. The other two boys were being tested, and when they came back positive, and my husband and my daughter and I did not, it was a scary time because we didn't know a whole lot. We figured, to be honest, that our 3 boys would be dead in a year or 2. We didn't know what to expect or what to do. We also wanted to protect other kids, so we went and talked to the school board and we told them, and things just really got out of proportion. And I think a lot of that was because of the fear. It could have been anybody's kids, but they were afraid, and they were trying to protect their children. So they didn't want our kids in school, and we ended up going to federal court for the rights for the children to go to school. They let my daughter go, but they wouldn't let the boys. There were, community meetings that were being held to try to figure out what to do. And during these meetings, a lot of times, people tend to get very heated. It's almost like a mob mentality. Our home was set on fire. I don't necessarily believe that it was somebody in our community, because by this time, our story was, national news. It really turned into be a positive. It forced us to, step forward and to continue educating and to continue moving forward.
It was the gay community that stepped up and got behind us when we were down and out. When we had nowhere to live, it was the gay community that found us somewhere to live. Our religious beliefs and the friends we made in the gay community had to go hand in hand.
Another common storyline from this time period is the connection between the gay community and the hemophilia community.
One of the best things that happened when Ryan was in the hospital, Dr. Kleiman told me, he said, "I know you're a strong Christian lady, but the people fighting this disease and trying to do something about it is the gay community." So he gave me the number of AMFAR. I called AMFAR, and that was the best thing I ever did, because on the other end of the line was a gentleman by the name of Terry Byrne. And Terry Byrne became my guardian angel. He said, "We're finding out here in New York far sooner than anywhere else what works and what doesn't work." He said, "Believe me," he said, "any time you have a question, you call me no matter what time of the day or night it is." And I did. I spent many hours talking to Terry. That was one of the best things, because it put us in communication to a lot of people that were fighting the disease too.
Many people in the hemophilia community that we've spoken to over the years tell a similar story. They were ostracized at home, at school, at church, at work, but embraced and supported by the gay community.
The images that come to mind when I hear these stories are both groups pushed aside by society and institutions, finding each other in the darkness and fighting side by side. You hear stories like Ricky Ray's parents' story about being taken in and supported by the gay community when their house was burned down, and stories about Ryan White becoming a meaningful figure in the gay community because his incredible advocacy and visibility helped shine a light on HIV/AIDS.
From the hemophilia perspective, connections like this were critical because of a lack of strong leadership from their community.
On the other hand, you'll hear some in the hemophilia community point out that Ryan and others receiving support from the gay community linked hemophilia so closely with homosexuality that it didn't allow enough attention to be paid to how people with hemophilia were being infected with HIV through their blood product, which resulted in it taking far too long for those products to be recalled and for the blood product manufacturing process to adapt. I think what you're getting by this point is that it is incredibly complicated, and we'll talk more about how complicated the relationships were and how complicated the fight to stop bad product being put out into the world was. But for now,
it's important at this point to touch on the National Hemophilia Foundation and their role in understanding and not effectively communicating the severity of the threat to the hemophilia community. A couple factors make this really complicated. Placing blame for something for this magnitude can be difficult.
There's actually a Washington Post article by journalist Elizabeth Castor from 1993 that does a good job of summarizing the complexity, and we'll read from it here.
The questions are,
When did the four major commercial blood producers, the Red Cross, the doctors, and the government, realize what was happening? And did they act appropriately once they knew? The first official warning came on July 8, 1982, when the National Hemophilia Foundation was alerted by the Centers for Disease Control that 3 people with hemophilia had come down with the newly defined immune deficiency syndrome. When the NHF began to investigate, however, the organization's leaders decided that the risk for hemophiliacs from not using the blood concentrate was far greater than the risk posed by this new disease, which seemed to be affecting very few people. There was a gross underestimation of what the effect of AIDS would be, says NHF Executive Director Alan Brownstein. Not because anyone was doing anything wrong. It was based on the data we had then. AIDS was something new, and it looked like it was going to be small. As the months passed, the NHF, the government, and the drug companies debated. Should high-risk blood donors, homosexual men, IV drug users, be denied the right to give blood? Civil rights groups objected. Should warnings be issued to doctors or patients? Doctors affiliated with the NHF insisted that such warnings could cause panic among hemophiliacs. Should the blood companies use a particular blood test for hepatitis B, which appeared to act as a marker for AIDS? Other published accounts refer to internal documents made public during several trials that indicate some of the companies were skeptical about the efficacy of the test or concerned with the cost.
This is a recurring theme in the criticism of the handling of the contamination crisis. Drug companies were accused of putting money ahead of lives because the cost to pull factor would potentially be greater than the cost of risking patient infection.
The Hemophilia Treatment Center community also, in some instances, continued to use clotting factor concentrates that were not virally inactivated after the Medical and Scientific Advisory Council for the National Hemophilia Foundation indicated in 1984 that only viral inactivated concentrates should be used. So there was some denial on all parts. There was denial by patients that this was really going to be a lethal disease. There was denial by physicians and healthcare practitioners that their kids that they had taken care of throughout their lives were really susceptible to a fatal disease. And there was denial at multiple levels within the pharmaceutical companies.
I just want to take a second here. You've heard us say several times at this point that it's a very complicated story. It's very complex to place blame. I just want to, on a personal note, the truth for me, for this podcast, the blame is above my pay grade. It's clear that the manufacturers knew they should have changed their blood collection and pooling practices years early. They should have adopted the German heat treating process years earlier. And they should have pulled contaminated product immediately. They did none of those things. But after that, there are too many layers of responses, too many layers of stakeholders and politics for me to cut through responsibly for this podcast. I'm an adopted member of the community, knowing my producing partner, Patrick James Lynch, for 8 years now, traveling around the world, meeting people with bleeding disorders, trying to tell their stories. People of all ages and backgrounds, families big and small. I am connected to the community, but I'm not a 60-year-old man who watched his friends disappear. I'm not a mother of a young man who passed away at 10 or 14 or 18 with his entire life stolen by HIV/AIDS. And I'm not a husband who lost his wife following sexual transmission of a disease he didn't even know he had. And I'm not a drug company CEO or a scientist at the CDC. My mission with this podcast series is to show the incredible revolution in care that Factor has brought. I mean, young people today can live nearly bleed-free normalcy that's almost unthinkable 30 years ago, while highlighting the devastating reality that we must always be vigilant about product safety and self-care. And I'm doing this not because I'm a Factor advocate, but because I wanted to understand and to show just how remarkable the revolution in treatment has been these last 50 years, and to bring some clarity to young people who, let's say, live nearly bleed-free, but maybe don't fully understand at what price that was made possible. If you do want a deeper look at exactly how this crisis originated and metastasized, two great places to start are Bad Blood and the HIV Story Project, our partners on this episode. So much of the powerful firsthand storytelling in this episode is from them. And I would encourage you as well to check out NHF's website for resources on how far the organization has come in the intervening 30 plus years. Lastly, if you are looking for the source material for much of what is known about the cause of this crisis and the aftermath, and even the legacy of the crisis and the work of those who survived, there's one truly comprehensive document, now an easily downloadable PDF, compiled by Dana Kuhn, whose voice you're hearing throughout this series. The document is called The Trail of AIDS in the Hemophilia Community. We'll include a link to it on the website and in the show notes for this episode, so the link should show up in your preferred podcast app as well. The document was used to initiate some of the litigation against drug companies and the congressional inquiries into what exactly happened. We'll jump back into the show now, and Dana can explain it better than I can.
I didn't really have anger or blame at that point because I didn't know how it all came about. I ended up giving up the ministry. I ended up sustaining a hematoma on my shin and then going to the emergency room and then being treated by a hematologist on call. And this time they treated me without any contaminated product. I was able to just tell the doctor my story, and by the end of the evening, he'd offered me a job in the hospital as a clinical counselor, which I accepted. As I was getting acclimated into helping families deal with expensive chronic illnesses, he put down on my desk a box of documents that he had collected since 1982. And they were all documents that, little did I know, really laid out who knew what and when between the Hemophilia Advocacy Organization and the manufacturers and the government. That's how we came up with a 350-page document called The Trail of AIDS in the Hemophilia Community. And it basically was a smoking gun. That's when I became angry.
Two young boys with hemophilia, Ricky Ray and Ryan White, became the galvanizing symbol for the hemophilia community around the issue of AIDS in the 80s and 90s. That if we had had a 35-year-old up there, it would have been a different situation, I think, because then they would have said, oh, well, you must have done some things in order to be in this situation. They were, you know, from right around the block. They'd be the kids that your kids will play with. They were innocent victims. They could be put in the media as the forefront of this is what's happening to our community. They were the voice for many of our community who were afraid to come out of the shadows. They were the voice that said, we need change.
This is another clip from the film Bad Blood.
But we have a compassionate payment. They did not acknowledge they did anything wrong. It was compassionately done. Canada is having criminal trials. France put 2 doctors in prison. The Japanese made them bow down to the moms and apologize. Do you know of any country that gives a compassionate payment of $100,000 to 7,500 people if they didn't do anything wrong?
A compassionate payment, of course, means making the payment out of compassion, not out of guilt. This language obviously still rows community members today, but the Ricky Ray Act was a victory. It was the first huge step toward acknowledgement, and it did provide some financial help to families and some financial disincentive for pharma to allow this to happen again.
Ricky Ray's parents, who you've heard from throughout this episode, and who fought for this bill, are some of the heroes of this era. Ryan White became a hero as well. He advocated around the country on popular television shows. He appeared on stage with Elizabeth Taylor at an event with Nancy and Ronald Reagan. Elton John became a personal friend. Michael Jackson, the Michael Jackson, wrote a song and produced a music video about him.
Ryan's work, supported by Jeannie throughout, has to be its own story. There's simply no way to cover it with the depth it deserves here. He was extraordinary.
And my company, Believe Limited, is working to tell his story in bigger, more appropriate ways. For now, just know he changed the world.
While Ricky Ray and Ryan White became well-known public faces of the hemophilia community's HIV/AIDS battle, another group was forming to fight for justice. COT, or the Committee of 10,000, was formed in 1989 to pursue economic justice for community members affected by the crisis and to work for better testing and a cleaner blood supply.
The Committee of 10,000 was formed in 1989. It was obvious to us that the national organization that existed at the time was not looking out for the hemophilia community, because they sent a memo out saying, continue to use your factor, when it was very suspect that it was HIV and HCV positive. So the Committee of 10,000 was formed to be a voice for those who were infected. We have been an organization that advocates for blood safety. We requested that the Institute of Medicine, that the IOM, did a complete and full study on what happened to the hemophilia community. Out of that IOM report came 2 committees that are specifically to look at blood safety. We have been pretty much the watchdog of the blood supply.
It's not an overstatement to say one of the big reasons that community members today have safe blood products is the advocacy work of COT.
We'll put a link to their website in our show notes.
When we think about life today for a young person with hemophilia, I mean, to be a young person with hemophilia today, there aren't a lot of things that cause you to look back to the contamination crisis. You can live nearly bleed-free with prophylaxis and all the advancing therapies. You trust your factor implicitly. You haven't seen or lived through any reason not to trust it. And pharmaceutical companies have advanced their collection and screening and treatment of product to radically improve safety. So if you're a young person with a bleeding disorder, do you know COT?
Do you know Ryan White and Ricky Ray? Do you know the Trail of AIDS and Hemophilia report? It's unlikely, and that's okay. That's honestly a good sign about the state of factor and other treatments, is that distance from tragedy that young community members enjoy. Is that weirdly the best tribute to the legacy of COT and Ryan White and Ricky Ray and Dana Kuhn, for instance.
Is the freedom to live without much fear of contaminated product and without much awareness of the blood contamination crisis of the 80s, the ultimate legacy of those who fought that war and died, or who lived to fight for justice after the crisis?
Yes and no. See, to a person, everyone who survived this era, who fought through it, will tell you that even with hugely increased safety standards, stronger and more vigilant national organizations, and educational support from the pharmaceutical industry, like support for this very podcast series, there is always a chance that another pathogen could find its way into the blood supply.
Or that a new, bold therapy could have unintended negative consequences, and that we would react too slowly, or that information would be withheld, because we're dealing with the human body and medicine and money. You just never know. So to put a fine point on it, we have to remain vigilant and aware as we move forward, while we honor those who came before us. This is the end of my interview with Dana Kuhn. You mentioned in our first conversation that you were questioning your faith shortly after being infected, like while you were kind of going through the experience of being newly diagnosed with HIV. Can I ask if you're comfortable talking about it? Did you lose your faith?
No, I didn't. I think I truly questioned, the reason why. If you commit your life to God's work and you're doing the best you can to also help try to lead people in their faith, and you've committed yourself to this kind of, a pastoral type of life, why would God allow that to happen? But I realized that, there's purposes in people's lives. And now that I look back 30 plus years, I can see why. I mean, do I still have those feelings inside, of hurt? Yeah. But I see the good that came out of it, and I see all the lives that I've been able to help change and save. I mean, what would have happened if I didn't find those documents and didn't collect those documents and didn't take them to legislators, and we didn't have a government that finally said that they were wrong in their decision making? It makes you feel good that you did something that changed the course of life for people in the United States.
The Factor Revolution is a BloodStream original produced by Believe Limited, written and produced by me, Ryan Gielen.
And me, Seth Kirshner.
Edited by Josh Davis and mixed by Michael Capuano at Icemen Sound.
A huge, huge thank you to the HIV Story Project for sharing their extraordinary collection of interviews with us, and to Marilyn Ness for sharing her film Bad Blood with us. Please check out both works. They're a crucial piece of our shared history, whether you're in the bleeding disorders community or not.
And a huge thank you to Dana Kuhn, Randy Curtis, Sue Garrity, Mark Skinner, and Michelle Rice, all of whom participated in in-depth interviews with us for this series, sharing their expertise, wisdom, memories, and insights. Please like, comment on, and share links to these episodes. We build everything we build here at Believe and at BloodStream Media because we think it's valuable to the community. So we're honored every time something we've produced is shared.
Happy listening.
Happy listening.
Thanks for tuning in to BloodStream Journeys. Again, if you enjoyed this episode of the Factor Revolution, you can check out the rest of the series on BloodStream Mini this month. I'm Heather Robb, and we'll see you in May. If you want to reflect on your journey to this moment right here, and tell your story, visit us at bloodstreammedia.com/mystory. We have a simple form. Write your story in it. Or tell us a little about yourself and what you want to write about, even if you don't yet know how. And click submit. We'll be in touch, and together we'll get your story told. BloodStream Journeys would not be possible without the incredible ongoing support of BioMarin, so we say thank you to BioMarin for their vision and generosity and all the ways they empower the bleeding disorders community to learn, heal, and grow through self-expression. Thank you, BioMarin. Other BloodStream podcasts include the community touchstone, the BloodStream Podcast. BloodStream is an entertaining and informative podcast hosted by Natalie and Patrick Lynch and provides a 360-degree look at the bleeding disorders community through news, interviews, and informed opinionating on the topics that matter most. We also produce the popular Ask the Expert podcast. Ask the Expert was created to help answer some of the biggest questions we receive from community members, both online and in person, as we travel the country producing content and live events for the community. Ask the Expert is hosted by Believe's Director of Innovation and former nonprofit executive, Amy Board, and features the top community experts on new subjects every episode. Also, there will be a bunch of new shows and podcasts coming throughout 2020 from BloodStream Media. So be sure to visit www.bloodstreammedia.com for all of the shows produced by us. Or you can search BloodStream Media anywhere podcasts are distributed, downloaded, streamed, or watched. Happy listening.